Nishmas, her mother, Ita Bas Miriam Pessel, here, so the Neshama Shavan Aliyah, we will thank Laura, and also by Dr. Andrea Stern and Isaac Singer in honor of Matana Vishai's second birthday. You got it right? Mazal Tov. Sweetie, thank you. The goal of this gathering is to somehow get into the Purim spirits. I have a feeling I'm not the only one that is struggling with the concept of getting into a festive mood after dealing with the devastating news of David Zieler's passing. So this is not really easy. This is not easy for anyone. And we have a levaya tomorrow, not an easy levaya. And we've been dealing, unfortunately, with several tragedies in the community, which take a toll on us emotionally. Sometimes that translates even to some physical situations. I was very exhausted today, actually. Just exhausted at some point today. And to go ahead and start talking about Purim and Oira, Simcha, Sasa, and Yikar, I don't know. It's not easy. It's not easy.
Give your issues.
Now, Judaism demands from us to somehow tap in to the season. You got to tap into this season. Tisha B'Av is easier some ways. I don't know why. Tisha B'Av is somehow a bit easier because there are things that are harsh in our existence, and Tisha B'Av can assist us to address it. I think Yom Kippur for me is actually is an easy day as well. I'm a big fan of the Yom Kippur concept. I like forgiveness because the record is loaded with the crimes and misdemeanors. You want something to clean the record. Purim has this challenge, especially for me this year. But nevertheless, I do thank you for coming out, and I do recognize that for every single person, when they looked at some point today at their evening schedule, they go, oh no, another outing? After last night, boy, I feel bad. The rabbi knows he's going to be there. So very kind of you, because it is not easy. It's not easy. And I understand it wasn't easy for me, and also we're not in the mood, but we committed to a shir. We're going to learn something. And I want to talk about six facts about Purim. Some of them you're familiar with, I'm sure, and most of them have been addressed in some way. But that's what I want to do, perhaps a little bit in the spirit of this very significant day in our tradition. Now, the first one deals with a misconception that I think every single year is taught to children. It's like a minhag to teach these kids something wrong about Purim. And now, I don't like the word wrong. But if there's something that doesn't have a source in halakhic literature, it's not something that has to be followed. But nevertheless, it is taught, and every single kid comes home from the Gan, from Beit Sefer, that the teacher mentioned that you give 2 items for Shalash Chmones, good, to one person. The language of the Megillah indicates 2 items to one person, but the children add that it has to be 2 items of 2 different brachot. This is what's taught to children. Children are taught that thing. And there's simply no source for such an idea. And every year I'll get into a fight with my kids because some of my kids always knew better than me at a very young age. And they heard in school that it's supposed to be of 2 items of different brachot. And we're giving out, an iced tea with a tangy taffy, and they're both sha'akol, no good. And we would have an issue there. Where does it come from? I don't know. Perhaps we do know that there are supposed to be 2 foods that are a little bit different, meaning you could give 2 cuts of meat, but they have to be spiced differently. So perhaps someone came up at some point, some 150 years ago, and to avoid the problem of just having 2 exact items, they said maybe they should be of different brachot, and it caught on. Perhaps that's just something that's interesting, and there's that tradition that we do have. I put that as number one on my list of interesting or intriguing facts regarding Purim. Now the next one relates to a story that my mother shared with us that occurred in Cleveland, Ohio, many decades ago on Purim. Now, I don't know if I remember all the details and facts, but it's an interesting story that it seems to be that my Bobby wanted to honor one of her children's teachers. And she decided that it would be nice to send some kind of necklace to the teacher. The teacher obviously deserved it for being patient with the child. And the right time to send such a gift would be Purim. So she put together a traditional shalachmanis with some cookies and hamantashen. And she threw in there a necklace as well, wrapped it and delivered it. And she didn't hear anything after Purim about it. Okay. On Purim itself, there was another person in Cleveland, right, that got a random shalach manas from someone they don't really know very well, but they delivered to that person. So they returned, and she opens the shalach manas, and there are some traditional cookies and hamantashen, and a magnificent necklace. And she was trying to figure out what was it. This is very nice, but I barely know her. So she struggled with the issue a few days, and then about a week after Purim, she called and she said, well, tell me one thing, why the necklace? And so you see, are you following a little bit here? Bobby sends to the teacher, recycle. Yes. Now when you recycle, there's a way to recycle. You gotta be sure to make it a little bit different, change the wrapping. But here, this was negligence in the recycling process, where she just took the shalach manas, ripped off the name, stuck on another name, and handed it over to the next person.
It was a hidden miracle.
So this is the story that it created a whole level of discomforts that they asked for it back. And the protein, the details I don't remember, but it brought up an interesting question that actually I found among halachic authorities. And to appreciate this halachic discussion, there are two personalities you have to remember. Number one is Rabbi Shlomo Al-Kabetz. Al-Kabetz. It's a high-end Sephardi name in Israel. There are several Al-Kabetz. It's a large family of Sephardim. Some of them are in the film industry. Some of them went into the police force, Al-Kabetz. But Rabbi Shlomo Al-Kabetz is a 16th century Kabbalist and poet who lived in Sfat. And I would call him one of the most successful Jewish poets, because to write some poetry, and then within a couple centuries in every single shul they're singing Lecha Dodi, that's not bad. That's real mazel. Obviously he deserved it. Rabbi Shlomo Al-Kabetz, the author of Lecha Dodi. So his personality, number one, you have to keep in mind. Number two is a Hungarian rabbi who lived in Budapest, and his name was Rabbi Israel Waltz. He was there before the war, perhaps sometime after the war. He was a great Torah scholar who lived in Budapest. Rabbi Waltz, okay? So you got Rav Shlomo Al-Kabetz and Rabbi Waltz. Now, the reason you have to keep these names in mind is because there was in Hungary, about 90 years ago, a rabbinic periodical where they shared words of Torah called Tel Talpiot. And they had an interesting discussion at the time. Yes, you're supposed to send 2 items as mishloach manot. Can one of the items be cigarettes? A real rabbinic question, okay? Scotch and cigar, they do go together, right? Would that be, what? Would that be acceptable? And Terry, you're thinking about your joint and brownie, right? That's what you're thinking. But would that work? Would cigarettes be considered acceptable for one of the 2 items?
You don't make a bracha on it.
Oh, you don't make a bracha on it. That's very good. So it appears Rabbi Waltz liked cigarettes. Maybe maybe cigars too, I don't know. And he wrote a shtickle Torah to defend the practice of sending cigarettes. Cigarettes, maybe two types of cigarettes, I don't know, right? Menthol and regular.
Not in those days.
What?
Not in those days.
No. So that was the shaila. So he went ahead and he shared with us the following, that it is well known that Rabbi Shlomo Kabetz, so again, this is Rabbi Volz, trying to get his point across by quoting Rabbi Shlomo Kabetz. And he said, listen, Rabbi Shlomo Kabetz, for Purim, do you know what he sent his father-in-law? Some food with a sefer, as shalach manos. And the sefer was called Manot HaLevi. It was a book on Megillat Esther. In Manot HaLevi, in the book itself that he sent as one of the two items, he wrote the following, that the purpose of Mishloach Manot is to bring people together. Some people are brought together by food, others by Sfarim, and Rav Volz adds, nowadays I think that cigarettes bring people together, so therefore I approve the cigarettes. Now, if you ask, he notes, that, hey, there's no bracha, so he says the following, Umi yodea, who knows, says Rabbi Volz in Budapest in the first half of the 20th century. Mi yodea im nitchadesh inyan ze b'yemei rabotenu zichronam livracha. Who knows if cigarettes would have been in existence in the days of the rabbis? Most probably hayu kovim alav bracha. It is so enjoyable. I have a feeling they would have made a bracha. So true, it wasn't in existence then. We can't make a bracha. But come on, cigarettes should be part of your shalach manos. This was a very interesting discussion, intriguing piece of information number 2 regarding Mishloach Manot. Fine? Okay, number 3. It goes back already a few years ago. We had a book review about the Aleppo Codex. Remember that? That was a nice one because it was a good book by Madi Friedman.
He wrote a new one.
I saw something about it, about the Sfaradim with working for the Mossad, the Mistaravim. So you're going to read it and tell us.
Maybe you will.
You have to first do, the first preliminary assessment.
For another time.
Another time.
Another book.
So we read the book. Now, the Aleppo Codex, there's been a great fascination since the book came out. The world is interested in it. The oldest Bible, pages vanishing, a dealer that showed up, calls someone, the next morning he's found dead. All these things are true. And there's a lot of interest in the Aleppo Codex. Someone supposedly is preparing a documentary about the Aleppo Codex. There's discussion, a lot of it taking place indeed. Now, for us, halachically, it became a relevant issue regarding Purim. We discussed this a bit. I'm going to expand a little bit more because it is quite fascinating. When you look at a Sefer Torah has paragraphs. There are paragraphs that are known as ptuchot, and there are paragraphs that are known as stumot. The general way to understand it is as follows. A paragraph that begins at the end of a line, but there are still words from the previous paragraph in the beginning of that line. In other words, where there's a gap only in the middle of a line, that is called a parasha stuma. It's a sealed paragraph. If, on the other hand, a paragraph begins in the beginning of a line and it does not have anything from the previous paragraph on that line, parasha ptucha. The Ramo, so for us Ashkenazim, we have to tune into these words. The Ramo was of the opinion that our tradition is that a Megillat Esther is written kol parshiotea stumot. The proper writing of a Megillat Esther. And Megillat Esther is compared to a Sefer Torah, where you have the parchment, and you have the ink, and you have the precision with the writing of the letters. And he tells us we are going to follow the tradition, kol parshiotea stumot. This is what the Ramo says. Ve'im shina, and he says that if you change it, pasul. Very strong statement. It's a must. Now, the big to-do, there was a big to-do in the early 1990s because when they finally got the Aleppo Codex section, not the actual section, but a copy of the section of the Aleppo Codex as it relates to Megillat Esther, some of the parshiot were actually ptuchot, not like the Ramah. And now you have this incredible question: do you follow tradition when a very old book indicates otherwise? And this made a very significant tumult. And you should know the Aleppo Codex is significant because this community in Aleppo and Haleb had a tradition that this was the book that Maimonides relied on to write his Sefer Torah. And even Ashkenazi halachic authorities note that we follow the Rambam. For example, there was a Lithuanian rabbi, Rabbi Epstein, the Aruch HaShulchan, and he tells us that when we write a Sefer Torah, they're all based on the Rambam. If they are based on the Rambam, and the Rambam used the Aleppo Codex, and today we have a copy of it, shouldn't we be following it and make an adjustment to our tradition? Or do you say, what do you mean? To change a Masorah? To change a tradition? How can that be done? And there was a major to-do in Bnei Brak, where there were those who believed we should make the adjustments, and others that said not. You know, when the interesting thing is, the section of Megillat Esther from the Aleppo Codex is actually missing. They only have a copy of how it was, meaning what the layout of the Megillat Esther was in that book, because in 1859, the rabbis in Yerushalayim sent a messenger, Mr. Yelin, to Aleppo to copy into his Tanakh the layout of the Megillat Esther as it appears in the Aleppo Codex. When he returned, he passed away, and the book was remained in an attic in a house in Kiryat Moshe. The reason I know about it too is because my grandparents, when I was a child, lived in a neighborhood called Kiryat Moshe, and they lived on Rehov HaMeiri number 1, and right next to their apartment was a big house, the Yelling house. Little did I know at the time that in that old house, when eventually they emptied it and went through the attic, they found that Tanakh that was brought back from Aleppo in the 1860s that had information that brought about the tumult in the early 1990s regarding if an adjustment should or should not be made to the Megillat Esther. So it's a fascinating discussion which some of us remember more detail, some less, but to go ahead and face new facts that rabbis in Europe did not have was one that brought about a very interesting discussion. For me, this is a good number 3 on my list. Now, the following has to do, so now we're moving on to number 4. Number 4. Have you ever heard of Rabbi David Oppenheim or Rabbi David Oppenheimer? David Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer is a well-respected. Isn't there a fund, some kind of mutual fund, the Oppenheimer Fund? No, it's not. It doesn't ring a bell. Okay, I have to ask. Rabbi Oppenheimer was a rabbi towards the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century in Prague. He was a very wealthy man. He inherited, I don't know if it was real estate or some kind of contracts, and he decided to spend a lot of his money on Sforim. He had a collection of some 6,000 or 7,000 Sforim and 1,000 manuscripts. The value was incredible then already, and as you could imagine over time, the value just increased. If you want to see his collection, maybe perhaps we could do a shul tour. We can make our way to Oxford, because the Bodleian Library in Oxford purchased the complete Oppenheim collection in the early 19th century. And he had, his love for Jewish literature was such that he would, if they would begin the process of printing any work, he would contact the printer. He would tell them that he's asking for a special printing but instead of on regular paper, on parchment. And he would demand that they go ahead and make a special binding for him. So he would get copies of printed works of that period, but only high-end for his collection. So between the value today, if you could just imagine, of 1,000 manuscripts that were valuable 300 years ago, we're dealing with something that's quite incredible. Rabbi David Oppenheimer was a great Torah scholar. Not an easy time for our people. In other words, for example, he dealt with a lot of shalas of aguna shalas. Why? There were wars in Europe at the time. He deals with the shaila of the Vienna community, because the old Vienna community had many minhagim. In 1670, they were expelled from Vienna. People returned to Vienna, but they were not from the original members of that community. Other people, for decades afterwards, would sign letters to him. And they would write, my name is so-and-so, mi megurashe Vienna. I am from one of those who has been expelled from Vienna. Vienna had again a Jewish presence, but they were not descendants, and they were not obviously from the original Vienna community members. Do they have to follow the minhagim of Vienna or not? These are the type of shalas he dealt with, like many and most Jewish shalas throughout our history that are quite depressing. He deals with some funny situations that tell us how different the world was then. There was a story that, an issue that occurred in a community in Czechoslovakia by the name of Stamfen, near Pressburg, near Bratislava, where there was a shochet / chazan. Often the job went together. He was a chazan, right? And during the week, he would shech the chickens and the meat, right? That was quite common. And a schnorr, a peddler, comes in as a guest to town, and he looks at their shochet chazan, and he says, how long has this fellow been here? They said, what do you mean? He's excellent. He's been here for 2 years, perhaps. 2 years. So the peddler, or whatever his status was, says, I need to talk to the rabbi. I got to tell you a little bit about your chazan / shochet. And he comes to the rabbi, and so again, this is occurring in Czechoslovakia, and he shares with him the following story, that I come from Kolín, near Prague. Your current shochet chazan was a shochet chazan by us for 12 years. One time, there was some kind of party, I don't know if it was a wedding or Purim, and he started drinking, and he drank a little bit too much, and he was loose. And he started talking about himself, the shochet chazan. And the shochet chazan said to other members, look at me, am I not a lucky man to be a shochet, even without having learned any dinim at all? Isn't that incredible? Am I not lucky? I learned nothing. What do you mean? So he says, listen, does it not astonish you that I've been here for 12 years and there's not been one treifa during a 12-year period? Doesn't it surprise you that for 12 years since my arrival, we've had assistance from above? All the shchitas and all the bdikos, every single time we slaughter a chicken animal, there's been absolutely no issue. He declared, he said, now he recovered from his, a few days later he did recover, and he denied, he said he was joking. They did a little bit more of research. They took him to the Rov near Prague. They asked him a few basic halachic questions. He knew absolutely nothing, and he lost his job. He lost his job, so what do? You go to the next community. You come to the community, you claim you're a chazan, you sing nicely, people like it, you get the job. So in community number 2, he was doing it for 2 years, and they have, it seems to be the same mazel. For 2 years, no issue with any of the chicken or meat. It was because of this peddler that showed up that informed the rabbi that they suddenly have to deal with the issue. It became a massive, it was no longer a local issue, because he was going from community to community. So they got Reb David Oppenheimer to go ahead and support the psak of all the Rabbonim that this person, they described him, should not be involved in shchita or chazones in any community. These were the types of questions and issues that he dealt with. Okay, Reb David Oppenheimer writes She'elot v'tshuvot Nishal David, was not published for many decades, but eventually it was published, and I'll share with you an interesting question that relates to Purim. He was asked about Megillah shekatva isha, ikshera likrot ba or not? A woman wrote a Megillah Esther. Would it be valid or not? Okay. Now, we do find that women don't write tefillin because it's not their mitzvah. Do we apply it to a Megillah Esther or not? An interesting question for 300 years ago. You would put that more in the 20th, perhaps 21st century, but he dealt with the question. So he writes this tshuva back and forth, and then he says, bottom line is, mistaber de kshera lichtov. He gives a stamp of approval. Reb David Oppenheim gives a stamp of approval. But then he ends off with the following words that you should know. You can't tell me that there's no minhag, meaning the minhag is that women don't. Don't give me that nonsense, he says. Because isha bechol ele lo matzati, I've never found a woman that has the ability and expertise to write in such a magnificent way, le'amen yadea lichtov ashurit, to write the complex letters that are required for a Sefer Torah. Vadai lo ra'inu enei raya. So his claim is, listen, it is an expertise and something so impressive that it's not the norm. Don't tell me we haven't seen it. We haven't seen it because circumstances have not created such a situation. So he gave his stamp of approval, and he was gushing a little bit over this woman that had the ability to do so. He compliments her. Fascinating tshuva, and it became a major discussion. There was a rabbi in Livorno. His name was Rabbi Chaim Yosef David Azulai, also was in Hebron, and he writes a whole back and forth regarding this halachic issue. So he's writing it towards the end of the 18th century, but this is a tshuva that appears in the 1710, 1720, and Rabbi David Oppenheim gave a green light for such a practice. Now what's fascinating is that only from literature about 100 years later in Prague, Rabbi Eliezer Fleckels, do we get a level of clarity why he was so impressed or why he was so overwhelmed by this young lady. Because, again, so this is 100 years later, they are talking about the very old Shaila, about the Megillat Esther, where so this is a later authority sharing with us the discussion that occurred 90 years earlier, and he tells us, you should know, there was a discussion about the Megillah that was written by Sarah, so we know the name of who that woman was. Her husband was Rabbi Chaim Yonah, and this Sarah, who was she? She was Bat Hagaon Rabbi David Oppenheim, his daughter. It was his daughter. And you can imagine it was probably a more cultured home where they've educated the daughter. There were books. This was a person that he had a talented young lady. Let her express herself. I did see a few years ago on one of these auctions online, an old Megillah from a few hundred years ago, written by a woman, and I would bet, I wouldn't bet, meaning I would not bid on it because it's probably expensive, but I would be quite confident that we're dealing with that Megillah Esther that was written by Sarah, that Reb David Oppenheim was extremely proud of his maidel that she was able to produce such a work of art. It would be interesting to go ahead and find more regarding...
What is the view today? What would be the view today if a woman wrote a Megillah?
Interesting question. Listen, you got Reb David Oppenheim. He is one of the great poskim. It would be an interesting discussion today, and I challenge anyone here to go ahead and produce one, and then we can have that halachic discussion. Hey, I know who you have in mind. Your daughter. She probably has a talent. She's artistic.
Yeah, but she writes ketubot
She
and
writes
stuff like that. Ketubot are accepted.
Okay, so tell her that now she can follow Reb David Oppenheim and make it interesting. Right. Of course she. Now remember, I've seen her work. So who does she? She takes probably after you, right? Right. Anyway, that was the next one. You know, we live in a generation where we all feel this deep attachment to Eretz Yisrael. It's a fact. It's a fact. An attachment to Eretz Yisrael. We have the privilege of visiting Eretz Yisrael, following Eretz Yisrael. We love the land. You have to realize how 200 years ago, 300 years ago, if there was a shtetl, and someone would come into that shtetl and they happened to visit Eretz Yisrael, even if it was a decade earlier, they would honor him. And they would want to hear stories about Eretz Yisrael. And would want to hear about the situation in Eretz Yisrael. We are a nation that had a thirst for knowledge about what is happening in our land. And we've lived with it. And Purim, by the way, this is going to be number 5, Purim is about remembering Eretz Yisrael as well. Because Shushan celebrated on the 15th, not the 14th, because they were still fighting on the 14th of Adar. We Jews do not celebrate on the day that we kill our enemies. We celebrate the day after, because we are believers of peace. It's very possible that throughout the kingdom it was enough to fight the enemies on the 13th and uproot anti-Semitism, because mission was accomplished within one day. Shushan had politicians. And since Shushan had politicians, you need some more time to figure out what they really believe, right? So therefore they needed that additional day of wiping out their enemies on the 14th, and they rested on the 15th. The rabbis wanted us to remember that there were 2 days established, and they go ahead and say if it's a walled city, celebrate on the 15th. They didn't want to claim that the wall has to be from the days of Ahasuerus, because then in Eretz Yisrael, where all walls and cities were destroyed, would not be considered significant. So in the words of the Rambam, we wanted a zikaron le'eretz Yisrael. We wanted a commemoration for Eretz Yisrael. So therefore, we have to have a wall from the days of Yeshua bin Nun. Remember Eretz Yisrael on Purim, the holiday, the miracles did not occur in Eretz Yisrael, but we remember Eretz Yisrael. But there's one more thing, which is the last one and the last point. I mentioned this in the Parsha class, that I have dreams of areas that I would like to one day work on, right? to have more of an expertise. And one of those areas would relate to the new neighborhoods of Yerushalayim, right? You talk about Yerushalayim. I was in a chat today talking to the students about this. I asked the students, imagine the year is 1830, and you are a wealthy Jew in Hungary, Lithuania, Russia, Poland, and you have the ability to make your way to Eretz Yisrael and live there. Now, there were few that were able to do so. No nefesh b'nefesh, no aliyah, but the concept of making their way to Eretz Yisrael, there were a few that did it, a handful. What city was the center, what was the most attractive city in Eretz Yisrael in the year 1830? So they all said Yerushalayim, but the answer is Tzfat. Tzfat was the go-to place. That's where it was exciting, right? That's where communities moved to. That's where the disciples of the Gaon of Vilna made their way to Tzfat. Fine. Now, what were the reasons for it? 2 reasons, basically. Number 1, as you know, in the year 1700, Rabbi Yehuda Hasid II, this charismatic Kabbalist, took a whole group of people to Eretz Yisrael. They purchased some area in Yerushalayim itself, and he was going to lead them. It was a time, you have to remember that there was still that enthusiasm, mystical enthusiasm, tail end of Shabtai Tzvi movement. So they were led by this charismatic person who unfortunately died 3 days after their arrival. He owed a lot of money to the Arabs. The Arabs were upset and eventually burned the whole area that was designated for Rabbi Yehuda Hasid, and it became known as the Churva of Rabbi Yehuda Hasid. Ashkenazi Jews were no longer welcome in Yerushalayim, and according to some sources, any Ashkenazi Jew that would show up throughout the 18th century, the Arabs would say, "Oh, you're an Ashkenazi, you owe us money." Why? Because of Rabbi Yehuda Hasid. When he came, right, we lent the group and they never paid us back. it was not a welcoming place for Ashkenazim. Everything changes in January of 1937. 1937, January, there was a massive earthquake in Sfat that killed hundreds, if not thousands, of people. If you go to the cemetery in Sfat, you'll see that in some areas, and they pointed to you, that some of the matzevos are this odd angle, and they say that it has to do with the earthquake. I don't know if you can see it, but I've seen it in the location itself. And suddenly, after that, Yerushalayim starts growing and growing and growing. And when Martin Gilbert wrote a book about those 30 decisive years that really created an environment for the new Yishuv, he talks about the 30 years from 1838 to 1868. Because within 3 decades, which used to seem to me as a very long time, now when you start remembering things very well from 3 decades ago, you realize it's not such a long time, 3 decades. Within 3 decades, Yerushalayim is not just a center, but rather it became impossible to live in Yerushalayim because there was no room. And therefore, by 1868, they are thinking of options of how do we start the process of getting people out of the city, and the concept of the suburbs and the new neighborhoods. And this is the field that I would love to know more about, the new neighbors. There's a lot of literature, and I've read a lot, but it's just something very exciting when they build Mishkenot Shananim, and Mea Sharim, and Nachlat Shiva, and Bet Yaakov, and Machne Yehuda, and up until today, you just have to look for it. You go to some areas in Yerushalayim and you'll find stones with names etched into them, with dates. And today you could go with your phone and you could tap in the names and find out about these people that have the merit of building and expanding Yerushalayim. Now, why do I love this? Because it is finally an area in Jewish history, and as we'll see soon, in halachic literature, that is exciting. It is not about being expelled. It's not talking about being kicked out of your city. It's not talking about an aguna. It's not the painful literature that we usually are handed. It's talking about the growth of the Jewish people and the growth of Yerushalayim. And what do you do in the new neighborhoods? So you have Rav Kook dealing with the issue in the 1920s. Beit Vegan, you know where Beit Vegan is. Is Beit Vegan part of the city or not? Is it detached from the city or not? So while in the 1880s they're having a discussion about Machne Yehuda, by the 1920s it's about Beit Vegan. And then in the 1980s it's about Ramot. It is an area of halachic literature where we're talking about growth, expansion. Yerushalayim is growing. That is uplifting. And that is hopefully what we could take a little bit from a season. You know, I'm not going to say the words the older we get, but the more we think about it, our identity has to be more than ourselves. It has to be about our nation, about what we represent. Who we are is not just ourselves. There's something greater and bigger. And the more we tap into it, the more we can deal with the fact that we are these fragile beings that are temporarily here. Because when you tap in to what, the Rambam uses the words that there's chomer and tzura. Chomer is material. Tzura is like an image. Chomer doesn't last forever. Tzura, an image, is eternal. In other words, if we go ahead and focus only on our chomer, on our material, my whole agenda and goal is to have a good meal, life is depressing because there's a limit how many good meals you could have, right? If my goal is something bigger, it's like an image. In other words, I think of myself as part of the people of Israel. And then I could step back and look what the people of Israel are achieving today, that there's growth. And Baruch Hashem, there's Torah growth and Torah knowledge and Torah study. And there's continuity and there's so many exciting things to look back and appreciate. The more we are able to do it, the more we could go ahead and uplift ourselves during the season. And this area of halachic literature, of the growth of Yerushalayim, is one that uplifts me. And hopefully it can uplift everyone because we do need uplifting. It's an opportunity that even though we're going to have, to go ahead and give comfort not just to others but to ourselves after a painful loss, hopefully we could merit a Purim Sameach, and may our gatherings be ones of happiness. And again, I thank you for coming out, a little bit of a conversation we had here, a little bit of a get-together, and we thank our sponsors again, and Erev Tov, good evening to all. Thank you. We'll do Ma'ariv, 60